Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Hello, welcome to the International Churchill Society's podcast. Today, Executive Director Adam Howard will be joined by Professor Frank Gavin, an American historian, currently serving as the Giovanni Anginelli Distinguished Professor and inaugural Director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Please join us for the conversation. Like, subscribe, and share the podcast.
Today, I am thrilled to welcome Professor Frank Gavin to the End of the Beginning podcast. Frank is a leading voice in international history and strategy, and he's currently serving as the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor. He's also the inaugural director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Now, before coming to Johns Hopkins, Frank held the first Frank Stanton Chair in Nuclear Security Policy Studies at MIT. And before MIT, he spent more than a decade at the University of Texas at Austin, where he was the Tom Slick Professor of International Affairs, and he also served as director of the Robert F. Strauss Center for International Security and Law. He's the author of several important books, but of course we're featuring two here today. He is a prolific published author because he's got two that came out, 3 months apart, less?
Actually, a month apart.
A month apart. So I think that's unprecedented, but we've got to be careful with that term when we talk about thinking historically. So two books, Thinking Historically, the one we're really going to focus on, it's a guide to statecraft and strategy. And then the book over here is Wonder and Worry, Contemporary History in an Age of Uncertainty, which brings together over a decade of essays he's written on global order, U.S. statecraft, and the challenges both scholars and leaders face in our time, which is going to be the theme of what we talk about today. I'm especially excited to have Frank on the podcast because he shares a passion that many of our members in the International Churchill Society feel very deeply, helping the next generation not just understand the past, but helping them learn to think historically so they can make smarter, more informed decisions for the future. And his distinguished work links rigorous scholarship with real-world policy in a way that I believe echoes Churchill's conviction that history shapes effective leadership. So Frank, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and one of the things I want to do right off the bat is get into the real meat of your book, because one of the things that strikes me, and I suspect this is your experience, but both my time working at the State Department or teaching George Washington University students, or even just watching CNBC, I have yet to find people who tell me, oh, history's boring, it's just facts and dates. Or history is, not really relevant because it's just, I only care about what's happening now and what's coming up. I generally find people throughout my career have been very much appreciative of history. However, I do find that more often than not, it falls into, well, what analogy can connect to now, or what lessons learned can I take away from it? And I think one of the powerful parts of Frank's book is that it's a little more complicated. So I was hoping, as your book describes, thinking historically is a disciplined way of understanding events, decisions, patterns over time, moving away from some of the seduction that comes with what many people, when they see this analogy that just seems so right for what's going on now. So for you, when it comes to in practice, what does it look like? How should we see thinking historically in terms of how people should actually get it?
So it's a great question, and one of the real challenges when you try to convince people the importance of history is exactly what you identified. It's not that they say, I don't want to think historically. Everyone appreciates history. The challenge is actually the opposite. Everyone is wired to believe they think historically. And as we navigate the world and we look at complexity and we try to kind of craft causal narratives in our head, that's how we survive. That's how we get along. The problem is that we don't always do it especially well. I am sure you have had this experience where you go home for the holidays, you go to a cocktail party and someone asks you, what do you do? And you say, you're a historian, and that you're a historian particularly of policy and politics, and then people immediately give you their opinions or their views or tell you how they think the world is. No one does that to neurosurgeons, right? No one does that to people who design airplanes. When you go home for the holidays or you go to a cocktail party and they say, well, I have some opinions on neurosurgery I'd like to share with you. So it's a blessing and a curse. The blessing is people are open to the idea that history matters. The challenge is that they're not necessarily convinced that you need any particular special training to do it. They think they naturally do it. And we see the challenge that a lot of people don't see any particular need to reflect upon how to do it better. And Dick Neustadt and Ernest May in their famous book, Thinking in Time, they've got this great quote about it. They say, teaching history to policymakers is like teaching sex education to teenagers. You can't tell them not to do it, but you ought to tell them how to do it better, more safely, and maybe enjoy it a little bit, right? And that's kind of the idea here, the notion that, and I spend some time in the book talking about this, convincing people that history matters is not the challenge. Convincing them that they need to be more rigorous and examine how they do it is the challenge, so that people like you and I who engage in this stuff and have engaged in this for decades can help convey some of the difficulty, some of the rigor, some of the challenges that are involved in thinking historically. Because this is probably the most controversial thing I think. I think thinking historically well is harder than good neurosurgery. I think it's harder than designing, excellent aircraft. But it's very hard to convey that.
When I hear the term rigorous, I can immediately see policymakers I used to see at State Department going, what about the issue of time?
Yeah.
So I'm going to use an anecdote real quick because I just want to mention this is something that always struck me. A lot of our members, they know when Churchill was in his wilderness years in the 30s, he wrote 4 volumes on his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. And many would argue he took away not just simple anecdotes. Like he understood by the time he got to 1940 that there was a way of thinking historically about coalitions and alliances from studying his ancestor and how John Churchill had dealt with Louis XIV. But he had time. All those years out of power. How, a policymaker says, Frank, this thinking historically sounds great, but how does this help me when I have to make decisions, especially nowadays like this?
Yeah, so this is a great point. In the book, I sort of talk about 2 different sets of skills. And the first is a historical sensibility, which is something that historians develop over time as they explore and research different cultures, civilizations, time periods, and they develop a certain set of skills, a temperament, a sort of an engagement with the world that makes them curious, epistemologically modest and humble. It makes them empathetic for people in the past. It generates a sense of tolerance, a variety of virtues that connects you to the human experience, where it shows you the challenges that all human beings have shared while showing the great distinctions and differences that have existed at different times and in different cultures. And that sensibility, which is something that you and I and other historians develop through being historians over the decades, is an extraordinary thing. But to your point, that doesn't help the policymaker facing radical uncertainty about the future to make difficult, consequential choices, which are usually what Henry Kissinger called 51-49 choices, right? You could do everything right and still get it wrong. And so what I do a bit of in the book is to talk about what are some of the explicit skills that historians develop that would be applicable in that moment of making decisions. I have one can't help but compare thinking historically to other methodologies, right? We spend a lot of time around economists and international relations theorists. In the book, I try to imagine exactly the scenario you set up, which is you've got 2 academic experts, one, say, an economist or an international relations theorist, and the other's a historian, and they have 15 minutes each to discuss a particular issue. And the international relations theorists, they believe in generalizability, parsimony, falsifiability, the collective building of knowledge, cumulative of knowledge, all of which historians are skeptical of. And this particular international relations theorist she's become famous because she's what Isaiah Berlin called a hedgehog. They have one big theory to explain everything, and they go in and they say, well, the case that you're looking at, let's say China, we've seen 9 times out of 14 rising powers have done this, and this is what you do in that particular situation. And they're very confident, they're very bold, their theory explains everything, they grab from the past. And historians, they're losing their minds, and you've gotten Thucydides all wrong, I don't know what you're doing with the War of Jenkins, and none of this makes any sense. And they become flummoxed, and they spend their 15 minutes kind of trying to explain everything that the IR theorists got wrong. And so part of what I tried to do is think, all right, how could you use that 15 minutes more constructively? And I go through the sort of comparison I use is a historical sensibility, what historians do. And I spend some time talking about why it's important to understand what we do and how we go about our work. That a historical sensibility is like a magnet, a powerful magnet that pulls all sorts of things from underneath the surface you wouldn't have seen, right? That magnet, when you pull stuff out, you weren't aware that it was there. Facts, people, phenomena, but it's overwhelming. And so the thinking historically part is then you take all of that, you have a chemical dye, which separates that which matters from that which doesn't matter. And so the thinking historically part is the chemical dye. And there's a variety of insights and skills that I talk about. The most important, of course, is the checklist, which I can talk about if you want.
Sure.
So I go through a variety of things that could help policymakers, decision makers, and the most important one, and I think most decision makers would agree with this, is to ask better questions, right? And so I develop what I call a historian's checklist, which is based on Atul Gawande, the emergency room physician, who wrote a book called The Checklist, or The Checklist Manifesto, where he had looked at in the 1930s, and 1940s, when the United States was preparing for the Second World War and started designing and building long-range bombing aircraft. These planes became more and more complex, and as they were experimenting and testing them out, they crashed more and more, and they realized it was through pilot error, because the systems were so complex. So they developed the idea if you asked a certain series of questions as you were preparing to fly, simple questions, are the flaps up, is the engine on, are different sort of things in terms of airplane, flying the airplane, that it reduced pilot error massively. So Gawande applied this to emergency room medicine. Have you washed your hands? Have you checked whether this tube is together? Have you taken the temperature of the patient? Very simple questions that if you went through the list, you ended up eliminating all sorts of error. So my idea was there should be a set of questions like this when any decision maker was facing a choice that involved history. And there are 12 questions in the list. There's some differences, right? The questions that are asked in the emergency room and for flying an airplane are more binary. Historical questions are always going to be interpretive. They're going to depend on perspective. They're sometimes going to be open-ended. But at least I thought these questions would help a decision maker sort of think through what were the consequences and potential unintended consequences of some of their choices as they were being faced with these difficult decisions.
So a checklist gives efficiency, I guess, so it would address the time issue. But my next question, and I'm thinking back to my experience with this, what about the trust issue? It's one thing, you have these questions, but policymaker, they don't really know the story, and maybe they've seen what you've written, let's say to you coming into the room. What are your values? What are your politics? How do you is there in your mind a way to get past that issue?
So that's a really good point, and I've thought about that a lot since the book came out. And it's less in the book, although there's an essay in Wonder and Worry where I kind of wrestle with this, in that I think a lot of us who are analysts in the foreign policy community forget that these decision makers are part of a political process, and that policy is a product of politics, and politics is uncomfortable because it involves clashing interests, different perspectives, and the questions of values. And I actually think historians have an advantage here. When you bring an economist or one of the more muscular social sciences, they're used to measuring and counting and where's the data and what does this all tell us? But they don't, and this is where I think this is something that Churchill instinctively understood, that in the end, policy is just a reflection of the politics, which is a reflection of the values and interests of whoever you're representing. And historians, because they understand those questions of values and culture and society and various trends, the things that can't be measured, I think actually have an advantage. I thought about this when I was rereading the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides talks about war as a product either of interest, fear, or honor. And economists and international relations theorists are really good at calculating interest. We can have all these debates about what an interest is, right? We can do an indifference curve. We can find the Pareto optimal spot where different people are. But we live in an era right now where most of our clashes, whether it's domestic politics or international politics, involve fear and honor. How do you measure fear or honor through an algorithm? How do you measure fear or honor through an economist regression or statistical analysis? And I actually think historians have huge advantages there in that they understand, like, if you look at our current era, I mean, where if you look in my lifetime, our material wealth, our abundance, our safety, our security, our access to information has increased by unimaginable amounts. From an interest perspective, we should all be incredibly happy. Yet we understand we're in a world of danger, anxiety, humiliation, resentment, which people in a political position understand. And diplomats understand too, really good diplomats, because they have to negotiate with different people who see the world differently. I think historians have enormous advantages in being able to speak that language. They understand complexity, they understand unintended consequences, they understand inherently the problem of outcome and retrospective bias. They know when they go to the past that the actors they study didn't know the future. Most policymakers don't know the future. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that make historians and decision makers there's more opportunity to be in conversation and understand each other than I think with other epistemologies.
With that in mind, I'm curious, can you think of a moment in recent foreign policy, this could be business, it could be technology, whatever you choose, where the absence of historical awareness led to that serious strategic mistake, and what, in your mind, would be a good historically minded leader would have done differently or seen things differently?
So it's a great question because, and I try not to, because one of the things thinking historically should do is to make you empathetic to how hard decisions is, right? Because I have this puzzle that I talk about in the book, and it's going to relate to the bad decision. In fact, I'll just tell the story about how this affected me. When it's kind of a personal story, but when I was finishing my PhD, I was trying to get a job, as one does, and I happened to apply for a job at the University of Texas at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Now, the reason the job was available, you'll love this, given your background, was that Harry Middleton, who had been the president of the head of the LBJ Library, the director of the LBJ Library, had convinced Lady Bird Johnson to let him release President Johnson's secretly recorded phone calls early. And they were a sensation. New York Times, 60 Minutes, and Harry was a brilliant archive director, an amazing presidential library director, and he became a mentor and a dear friend. But so he created this whole great stir. So the way the LBJ school and the LBJ library worked is they were both under a shared foundation, which generated extra money for them to do things, scholarships, programs, and the like. And so twice a year, the head of the LBJ Library and the head of the LBJ School had to go meet with the board of the LBJ Foundation, which were former LBJ people and people who were very generous with their time and their resources. And you could imagine Harry saying, they said, "What did you do this year?" "Well, we released the tapes and we got this kind of attention." And the LBJ School at that time focused largely on state management, how to build better highways and roads, local, crime enforcement issues, which is very, very important, but not super sexy, right? And so my sense was that the head of the LBJ School was sent you got to get a historian to explain this. So they advertised for a presidential historian. I applied. I'm not a presidential historian, but you want to get a job, you'll become one. And so I got out there, and I arrived in the fall of 2000, right around the same time Governor Bush was running for president. So it was an exciting time to be in Austin. And I was wrestling with, what should I teach? And so they had a course called Policy Development. And I thought, well, I could teach that. And how I structured the course was to look at what I considered two different policies. One that was a success, American policy towards the German question after World War II, and the second, a disaster, which was America's policy in Southeast Asia. And we would end up, we'd read Fred Logevall's Choosing War, and then I would have the students go to the LBJ library, look at the documents, and we would do a simulation of President Johnson and the decision to escalate the military escalation in Southeast Asia. And the students loved it, so I taught it again in the spring. And of course, I used this as a cautionary tale. And at the end, the second time I taught it, I said, well, at least we don't have to worry about this again. Of course, this is several months before the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. were horrific. I remember them very clearly. But I also remember there was this general attitude in the policy world and in the general culture where this was day zero, right? Everything after 9/11 was new. There were no lessons from the past, which, as terrible as 9/11 was, historians know there is nothing new. And the sort of desire to say everything we knew is thrown out and we have to reinvent what it is we're doing, I thought at the time was a disaster. And if you look at the consequences of the global war on terror, and particularly the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it's hard to say a quarter century later that these were wild successes of American grand strategy. And it's not to say a historical awareness wouldn't have prevented this. I mean, one of the great ironies is I always ask people this trivia question: what president probably read more history than any? It's George W. Bush. He and Karl Rove had a competition on this. And I've talked to our good friend Will Inboden about this. I don't think these skills that I talk about in that book, thinking historically, were necessarily present. And so I think after the horror of 9/11, it would have generated a different question set. Now, I should say, I don't say this to take a kind of a, I try in the book not to be political, even though politics matters enormously. The Johnson administration example I gave of what I consider, and most people consider, the most disastrous grand strategic decision the United States made in the post-World War II period, the Vietnam War, the same people at the same time crafted America's nuclear nonproliferation treaty, or America's non-proliferation policies that led to the NPT 3 or 4 years later, which I consider the greatest success of American grand strategy. So the same people at the same time created a disastrous policy and created a wildly successful policy. They didn't lose 20 IQ points going from one meeting to the other. Policy is hard. Historians understand this, and that's why they're empathetic to it. And when you criticize, it's not to say these people are dumb or corrupt. It's that these are really, really hard choices. And here are some of the ways history can help you. And by the way, President George W. Bush, in a way that was historically unprecedented, in the same speech where he announced the axis of evil, which I considered historically deeply problematic, he announced PEPFAR, right, which probably has saved 25 million lives, right? So it's making policy, particularly grand strategy and foreign policy, in a complex, dangerous world is very, very difficult. And I think if people at these moments of consequential choices and pressure step back and think historically and don't act like everything's unprecedented. By the way, this is something I'm worried about with our AI debate, artificial intelligence debate, where everyone asks, this is sort of, we've never seen anything like this before. I'm like, have you studied electrification, right? Like, you're going to argue to me that AI is going to have more profound societal, economic, and military consequences than electrification.
Or the printing press.
Or the printing press, right? Like, And it's not to say, to your earlier point about analogies, that there's direct parallels. But when you investigate something in the past, you see and ask different types of questions. And that's the kind of thing that I think we should do. So that's a long-winded answer of saying that I think that the George W. Bush administration's post-9/11 decisions, which at the time I thought could lead to catastrophe and fiascos, have turned out to be deeply problematic. And I think if there had been more of a thinking historically mindset, that doesn't guarantee that things would have been wildly better, but different questions would have been asked, different issues might have been looked at from different angles, different perspectives would have been engaged, and I think you might have had better outcomes. And another thing I talk about in the book, thinking historically also allows you to update quicker. If you've made a decision that is not turning out as you expected, that if your assumptions going in are demonstrated to be incorrect, thinking historically should allow you to self-correct more quickly.
On that point, do you feel this also addresses the issue of predetermined outcomes, where scholars always talk about Lyndon Johnson, and here was this team that he inherits from President Kennedy after assassination, who seemingly, especially when you read Neustadt and May, I mean, they did it all right when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Same group of people, more or less, got it wrong, or seemingly got it wrong when it came to 1965 in Vietnam. How's that possible? And could this thinking historically and the techniques you talk about, the 12 questions, would that probably have addressed it? Or as you said, it's really hard. It's just really hard.
This is we could have a whole 3-hour conversation about the mythologies around the Cuban Missile Crisis that May and Neustadt certainly did their part to,
propagate.
If you want my theory of what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that, and I've spent a lot of time on the Kennedy tapes when I was working at the Miller Center, the conclusion I came to was that Kennedy put all of his advisors in a room so he could go and make the decisions with his brother. And that all those ex-com meetings were basically a way, and the guy who figured it out was Dean Acheson, who said, I'm not going to participate in this because I see what's going on. That's my interpretation. It's not May and Neustadt's interpretation. And again, one of the things I talk about in the book is that the great thing about history is that we argue about these interpretations, and even though that's frustrating to outsiders, that's a really good thing.
I feel like that's going to be another book we're going to have next time I talk.
It's funny, I'm seeing Fred Logoval later this week, and he's working on his JFK biography, and we have these arguments all the time about, but I think that and I'm seeing Graham Allison too with this week, and he's, with his notion of essence of decision, which was the book that kind of studied this. I think there were a lot of lessons that have been misunderstood from that. I think that one of the other things, and this is more of a historical sensibility, generates is a sense of humility, right? Now, we don't elect humble people. We don't make humble people secretaries of defense and secretaries of state. Humility is not something that the American people even necessarily reward as a virtue. So this is a challenging thing to instill in the policymaking process. But if thinking historically was similar to some of the kind of red cell, red teaming that goes on in the government, which is to say, what are the things we're not thinking of? What could make us wrong? What are we not thinking of? One of my favorite of the sort of questions is, what are unspoken assumptions? And it's unanswerable because by definition they're unspoken. But when you just highlight for people that, the simple issue of saying, if you have kids or grandkids, they're going to think your views when they're your age are ridiculous, just like you thought your parents' and grandparents' views were ridiculous. Why on earth would you think your assumptions about the world are foolproof? And the unspoken assumptions comes from James Joel's explanation of thinking about the cultural, intellectual, and political environment of Europe in the summer of 1914, where there were these shared common beliefs that no one ever questioned because they were kind of groupthink. Everyone thought them. And it helped lead to the disaster that happened. And people are only aware of it 50 years later. If you could ask people in a room, what is it we all think we know about the world that we assume to be true that might not be true? Because history shows us the odds are we're going to get some things wrong. I mean, I think this a lot about a lot of the debates in this town over great power rivalry, or the talk about Cold War II, which drives me crazy, right?
Yes.
But there's an unspoken, or what are your unspoken assumptions about China's rise, right? That you're not really testing. So there's no guarantee, even in the best, as Kissinger said, these are 51-49 problems. You could do everything right and get it wrong, and you could do a lot of things wrong and get lucky and get it right. But I do think you will both improve the likelihood you'll get it right, and if you get it wrong, you'll recognize you got it wrong quicker if you think historically.
So as long as you follow a process like this one, at least you know you approached it in a way that gives you a chance to get that 51.
Yeah, although I would say it's a process, and this is the tough thing about the historical sensibility, I don't know the answer to. I mean, you've been in government, and cultural change in policy making is really, really hard, right? I mean, but I do think, and this is where leaders matter, right? You have someone like Churchill, right? He sets culture for a government. He sets culture for an intellectual debate, right? You have someone like Churchill who obviously thinks historically, has a historical sensibility. That's going to affect, and there's a reason why I think British diplomacy and statecraft punched above its weight in the ways it is. It doesn't mean he was not immune from mistakes, and I don't think anyone would ever accuse him of being overly humble. But he had that sense of history's rhythms, complexities, consequence. And the U.S. doesn't have that for reasons we know and understand. But if you could imbue that a bit more, this is again why I think the incredible work that you did at the State Department, having that kind of sense that you're part of a larger historical stream, that people went through this before, that you could say, hey, how did Stimson think about this question that emerged in East Asia in the 1930s when we're wrestling with this? Or, was it about a year or two ago and it looked like Venezuela was about to attack Guyana? Like, what is that 1894 agreement? What were they thinking when there was this dispute over what had been Guyana and what was Venezuela? And I think finding ways to not just through a process, but through a general culture, which, again, I worry about greatly us losing it because of all the problems in the history discipline. But I think it's both process and a kind of a larger sensibility that's needed.
That really takes me to another topic in your book that I thought was really interesting and I think related to what you just described, which is the translators, right? You've talked about translators are a way to bridge the gap between historians and policymakers. Can you help, especially for our listeners and viewers, what do you mean by that? And then are there good examples of how translators can ensure this historical insight? You've touched on a little bit with the work I did at the State Department, but maybe there's other ways you can get into that issue as well.
Yeah, it's because you step back and you think about the world we grew up in terms of getting a PhD in history, in the academic history world, and it could not seem further removed from the world of policy and politics, right? You become a historian, it's a very lonely sort of activity. You kind of self-select into people who are not necessarily wanting to be in big crowds. They want to do their work. They're very careful, they're precise. Fair to say maybe even a little bit fussy, right, about getting the documents. Yep. They want to work in a calm, slow sort of way. The policy process is far more fast-paced. It's almost always a collective activity. You're going to have to make compromises. And so even though I think in a lot of ways the set of problems that policymakers and historians face are similar, and there's a sort of empathy there, the way they kind of have come to their worlds could not be more different. And I think finding ways to bring them closer together, to translate what that historical work is, but also to translate those habits of a historian. And then for the historians to have a better sense of the challenges and dilemmas that people under enormous time pressures, facing complex decisions face. And I think there should be what we've, this great stuff you did in your office, a school like SICE, where we're trying to convey to young people who are going to be diplomats and strategists, not just in the United States, but around the world. I don't know how many foreign ministers of South Korea we've had as graduates, 3 or 4. The longest serving ambassador from the PRC to the U.S. was a SICE grad. So to try to find a way to explain to those young people who are going to be more likely than not be historians, but be in decision-making positions, to help them understand how you can take this kind of historical knowledge, this historical sensibility, this historical thinking, and as they advance and develop through their career, find ways to access it and put it into their work. Which is one of the reasons why I have been an advocate of not just history departments teaching history, that it should be taught in policy schools, it should be taught in law schools and business schools. Look, I even think, when you think about, I was thinking about this the other day about medicine and being a medical doctor. When you make a diagnosis, you're usually telling a causal narrative that's historical, and that's changed over time. If you went to a doctor in the 1920s and you first worried about anatomy and you had a stomach ache, they would focus on your organs. 30 or 40 years later, that narrative would include genetics as that developed. After that, you had more integrative medicine, looking at different parts of the body and how they interacted. And then over time, people became convinced that environmental factors affected your health. And all of those changes in how a doctor would diagnose you is in some sense historical. They are telling a history, but they're telling it from different perspectives. And so I actually think there is an argument for teaching this kind of history, say in a medical school, not just so they understood the history of their own discipline, which has changed, but when they're thinking about making a diagnosis, they're actually practicing history. So they should understand what are the best and worst practices, what are some of the sort of pathologies and problems and mistakes people make, and what are some of the better ways of doing it. So I don't know if that gets to sort of what you were thinking about, but that's sort of when I think this should not be kind of a sort of a niche epistemology that's kind of pulled out and the smoke blown off and you kind of find historical analogies. I think it should be recognized that most of the important analysis we do is somehow usually a historical causal narrative that's constructed in some way or another. And historians know how to do that really, really well, and that sort of skill set should be taught and appreciated more widely.
And I think one of the things that I appreciated working as a government historian was the fact that the government invested in translators. As much as there may be criticism that the policymakers haven't always done well with history, at least they've invested saying, we do need, every agency, by the way, in the United States government has at least a historian, if not a team. And by the way, governments around the world, not all, but many have historians who serve the institution for institutional memory, historical context for policy, but also for preserving historical documents. So I think it does speak well to the societies that invest in that. So,
absolutely.
Let me ask you this. You've published the book. You've been thinking about this for years. I mean, I've been reading your articles that really show the thinking that comes through in this book. Have you had a chance to actually get in front of policymakers and be able to say, hey, I have this list we can go through. Here's a way to think about things. I'm not going to do simple analogies, but let's talk through, or...
So I have not had a chance since the book's been out to say, brief the current administration. I have not had a lot of calls from them. But one of the things that inspired this book is I have had the great honor of being able to engage with people in decision-making situations, which has made me that much smarter. I mean, I mention this a lot, but 20 years ago, when Jim Steinberg became dean of the LBJ school, and I was very skeptical. I think he's this DC insider. What does he know about this kind of stuff? And this was a guy who had been deputy national security advisor, head of policy planning, deep appreciation of history, and someone who had skepticism of other epistemologies, and we started teaching a course together. We ended up running a program called the International Policy Scholars Consortium and Network, and it was aimed at PhD students in history or in political science or even in law and other areas who wanted their scholarship to affect policy or maybe wanted to become policymakers. And it was Carnegie funded, and we ran it for 10 years, and we had a bunch of people come through it who ended up becoming important policy people. You know, Rebecca Listner, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President, and if Harris had won, you know, probably would have had a very senior position. She was our first student in the SIPSCON. It was as an ABD at Georgetown. And much of what we did in this program was historically oriented. So Phil Zellico, who is a great historian and was a great policymaker, was part of the SIPSCON program, and he would do these historical simulations. He did one on 1898 and the U.S. decision, particularly as it involved what was going on in the Philippines. He has this amazing exercise he did on the Suez Crisis based on a book he had done with Ernie May, where you looked at 6 different capitals over 3 different time periods, and the students would have to wrestle with the history of making decisions. So that was just sort of eye-opening, and Phil's has a bunch of these that are really, really good. And of course, you know, I run a center named after Henry Kissinger, and I had the great honor of spending an enormous amount of time with Dr. Kissinger when the center began. And I would go up and visit him in New York at his office at 350 Park or at his apartment in Manhattan, and I would ask him, how does one become Henry Kissinger? What skills should people have? And he would always say history. I mean, his PhD was in government, but if you look at what he actually wrote, he considered himself a historian, and he considered a sort of an understanding of the past was absolutely critical. So I could see these moments of different policymakers who recognized and understood it. They would look at other epistemologies, was IR theory or public policy or law or whatever the case may be, economics, and there's some benefit there, but you would find them really drawn to history. And if you told them, well, you can do it better, we could do it in a more rigorous way, they usually found that appealing. So I would say it was a good test for me, because these were people who would say, well, that's no help when I was in government. You know, having Jim Steinberg, we've co-taught a course where we use history for policy for 20 years. And, you know, it was interrupted only by the time when he had to actually go back into policy to be Deputy Secretary of State. And so whether it was the younger students who would then go on to great things, or whether it was some of my contemporaries or mentors, it was always a good test to say, is this something that would be useful to you in those decision-making situations? And they were always very positive.
I'm curious, based on what you described in terms of the way people were learning in these different situations, I'm hearing experiential learning as being more the choice as opposed to a formal lecture or making them read books. Do you find that students or policymakers or anyone, frankly, for that matter, get it more when they're actually in a simulations or in a situation?
I think it's a combination. I don't think there's anything that replaces deep reading and wrestling with, I mean, if you have the opportunity, wrestling with the sources and trying to make sense and trying to construct. When you have students and you ask them to look at the documents and construct what happened, again, that's very labor intensive. Short of that, wrestling with different interpretations. Take 3 or 4 historians and look at the question of the origins of the First World War. Why did they come to different conclusions? How did they marshal evidence? What were their theories of historical change? What was their theory of historical causality and agency? Doing something like that, then in addition to the experiential side, I think it can all be sort of integrated together. And I hadn't thought about that since you asked that, but I do think that experiential element, there are limits, and there's obviously a really interesting move afoot, particularly in political science, to look at wargaming as a method. to sort of explain things. I think there's a lot to be said about that. And I do also think that getting out of the historian's solitary work in the archives and being in that interactive, more communal, more decision-making environment might make them more sympathetic. I had a really good friend. I don't know if you've ever met Drew Erdman, who's Ernie May trained student, wrote a fabulous dissertation on changing conceptions of victory in American history. And I remember when he got his PhD around the same time I did, he said, I need to go into government. I need to learn how decision-making works. And he went to policy planning in the first W. Bush administration. Then he was at the NSC, and then he was the Minister of Higher Education, the CPA in Iraq, and he had extraordinary policy experience. And I think he would say that it made him a better historian. And, I love Kissinger, but I do challenge his notion that you have this intellectual capital beforehand and then you go into government and you draw down on it. Yeah. Most of the people, in fact, my friend Colin Kahl was just named head of the FSI at Stanford. He took this quote where he said, he's a political scientist, and I forgive him that, but he has this quote where he says, I actually learned by doing this. And I think the combination of having the historical insight, but then getting to put it in practice and then come back, I think there are extraordinary opportunities there. So I think that all these elements can kind of come together.
So all the above.
Yes.
Is the answer on this one.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank Frank Gavin for taking the time. I really encourage everyone who's been listening, watching, in our audience who appreciate this kind of conversation. You've got not one but two books to consider in terms of really understanding these different concepts we've talked about tonight. I think one of the great things that I love about thinking historically, even though we've been talking in the geopolitical national security context more often than not, this could apply to anything. And in fact, there's a great example of Ben Bernanke and how he reacted to the Great Recession, thinking historically. So it really doesn't matter what field you work in. Thinking historically is always a relevant approach to trying to address these kinds of problems. And of course, as I said before, Frank shares the passion that I have and that many of you have when it comes to that next generation of leaders and how we can help them when it comes to thinking historically about how they can help address these many problems and crises that we're dealing with. So thank you again, and until next time.
Thank you for joining us for the International Churchill Society's podcast. Please share this, subscribe, follow us on social media, and check us out at winstonchurchill.org.